One of the most bewildering passages in the entire Bible is no doubt found in Genesis 22, where Abraham is asked by God to sacrifice his only beloved son, Isaac, the son of the very promise that God had given him. As you can imagine, this passage has been discussed and interpreted and given different interpretations throughout the centuries. What I want to talk about today is a specific interpretation of that passage in Søren Kierkegaard's book Fear and Trembling, which he wrote in 1843. Kierkegaard anticipated that this book alone of all his writings would prove to make him immortalized as an author. And he was right about that, but he's also been immortalized for many of his works. But this interpretation, this book, is not just one more view of this passage about Abraham and Isaac. This was part of a larger philosophical system that Kierkegaard was pioneering, which has become known as existentialism. Now, in the popular sphere, some of the ideas in this book you're perhaps familiar with. You're perhaps familiar with the leap of faith, perhaps even the night of faith. These ideas actually show up quite literally in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where Indiana Jones has to take this leap into the void and trust that he's not going to fall to his death. And after he goes past that bridge, past the abyss, he arrives and sees this solitary night of faith. Both of these ideas are taken from Kierkegaard. But as you can imagine, there's a little bit more to them than you can get from pop culture. So that's what we're going to talk about. And I want to just talk about why this book seems to have been so influential in 4 different ways. And we'll explain the book and give something of an introduction to it as I go. So, first reason why this book is influential is that it challenges a widely accepted outlook sort of from within. So just imagine like going on Facebook or something and you really disagree with a certain way of looking at things, and so what you do is you post some controversial thing that disagrees with that. Well, how many people are going to suddenly be converted to your way of thinking? Well, I think we all know this. None. No one's going to be. Kierkegaard comes along and he writes actually from a pseudonym. He didn't publish the book as Søren Kierkegaard. He published it as Johannes de Silentio, which is an absolute brilliant choice for a number of reasons. We'll explore one more. But one of the things that does is it sort of allows Kierkegaard to take on a view by adopting this persona. And what he makes Johannes do is sort of take for granted what most people, or at least most thinking people of that day, thought was correct. And most thinking people of that day, and even I'd say surrounding culture, sort of just accepted this philosophical framework that came from G.W.F. Hegel, known as Hegelianism. People just lived and breathed this. So Hegel followed in the line of people like Immanuel Kant, and Hegel had his own views that weren't always the same as Kant's. But both of these thinkers and others besides were part of German idealism, and this was more broadly connected to the Enlightenment, major political revolutions, think American and French, so hugely influential ideas. And Kierkegaard didn't really agree with Hegelianism. So he comes in, he sort of presupposes that viewpoint, and then he points out some flaws within it. So just briefly, in Hegel's system of thought, as he called it, in his system, he described something that he called absolute mind. Now, to get to absolute mind, human consciousness can come a certain way through things like art. It can come a little bit further through religion, but it comes furthest through philosophy. And as you can imagine, his philosophy, pretty much gets you there, gets you to absolute mind. So all you've got to do is build up this way of thinking and you've arrived at absolute mind. Well, Kierkegaard doesn't agree with that, and so he writes as Johannes de Silentio, and he points out some problems that seem to crop up with this. Hegel, as you just heard, he sort of puts religion or faith a little bit lower on the totem pole, and what Kierkegaard is going to do with it, as we'll see, is do something that's totally unexpected. So first way this is influential is that it challenges a widely accepted outlook, sort of from within. A second way that this book is influential, and this one could be really appreciated by a lot of people today, is that it says it's actually harder to be an individual than it is to be the universal. Now, a lot of people today really resonate with this. Be yourself, do what you're given to do. As you can imagine, though, Kierkegaard doesn't quite just show up and say what Disney movies would tell us today. There's a little more to it. So let's clarify what he thought. So going back to Hegel, Hegel didn't treat the universal as opposed to the individual. He didn't treat the universal as just, go out on the street and see what other people think. That wasn't it at all. For Hegel, the universal was a well thought out system, his well thought out philosophy. And the idea was every thinking person should be able to agree with this. Now, when it came to the sphere of ethics, for instance, Hegel would say, well, don't murder, that's pretty much absolute. Give yourself for a noble cause that's bigger than yourself. That's an absolute virtue that we can all admire. And this is crucial, what Hegel would say is if you've reached those absolute ethical standards, then there can't be anything higher. It's not like God's going to show up and violate those absolutes. If you've reached those, you've reached absolute mind, and what absolute mind would have you do. Okay. So Kierkegaard comes in and he divides his work in part into three problemata. Problems, right? Now, I'm not going to go into all of these, but the first problem that he brings up is in the form of this question. Is there, in this story of Abraham, is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, welcome to trying to read Kierkegaard. But let me explain what it means. Teleological comes from the Greek word telos, which is end or goal. So what he's saying here is this absolute ethical standard in Hegel's system, this universal standard, for instance, don't kill, is that suspended in the story of Abraham? And of course it is, because Abraham, he says, is asked to murder Isaac. So, for Hegel, you don't murder. The problem is that God, who should be this absolute standard, who should be all about this universal principle, is asking Abraham to violate that absolute. Now, Kierkegaard refers to this, and this is very important, as a paradox that faith must accept. And paradoxes, a really good paradox at least, in a lot of ways you just can't understand it. So Kierkegaard will later say that Abraham, if he is to receive Isaac, has to give him up. There's a passage where he says that if he loves Isaac, he has to hate Isaac, because you don't kill someone unless you hate them in that moment. And so Abraham is asked to hate Isaac in order to love him. Now, if you're biblically astute, you're perhaps reminded of some words of Jesus, which he utters in Luke 14:26, where Jesus says that the person who does not hate father, mother, children, family, even their own soul, even their own life, is not worthy of him. And what Kierkegaard does is he leans into that and he says that's exactly what's going on with Abraham. It's exactly what Jesus is teaching, and he recognizes in his day and in ours, there's those people who look at that passage and they're like, oh, it's just sort of a poetic way of speaking. It just sort of means you just have to love them less than Jesus and love them less than God. And I love what Kierkegaard says to the one who would interpret things that way. Kierkegaard says, if this pious and tender-minded exegete, who thinks he can smuggle Christianity into the world by haggling in this way, should succeed in convincing anyone that grammatically, linguistically, and by analogy this was the meaning of the passage, then it is to be hoped that in so doing he also manages to convince the same person that Christianity is one of the most miserable things in the world. For the teaching, which in one of its most lyrical outpourings, where the sense of its eternal validity swells up most strongly, has nothing to offer but a sounding phrase that signifies nothing and suggests only that one is to be less kind, less attentive, more indifferent. The teaching which, just as it seems to want to tell us something terrible, ends up in drivel rather than terror. That teaching is certainly not worth standing up for. So, for Kierkegaard, he wants to say this is not Hegel's system. This is not just figure all this out, figure out absolute duties, and you've arrived. What Kierkegaard is saying is let that paradox be. Let that difficulty be difficult. It cannot be, this is important, it cannot be understood. The paradox cannot be simply understood. If you're just to follow the universal, again thinking of ethical standards, then you can be perhaps a tragic hero who's understood. Everyone can follow why you did that. But for Kierkegaard, there's also a knight of faith who no one can understand. So consider also what Kierkegaard says on just a little bit after what I quoted. Here he has in mind those people who think, but obviously God doesn't want Abraham to kill, he doesn't want him to murder, and so how can we tell people to be themselves? How can we tell them to be the individual, to do what God has asked them to do, even if it doesn't make sense? Shouldn't it make sense? Here's what Kierkegaard says about that. He says, there is a fear of letting people loose, a fear that the worst will happen once the individual enjoys carrying on like an individual. Moreover, living as the individual is thought to be the easiest thing of all, and it is the universal that people must be coerced into becoming. Again, the universal there is these ethical standards. Kierkegaard says, I can share neither this fear nor this opinion, and for the same reason. No person who has learned that to exist as the individual is the most terrifying thing of all will be afraid of saying it is the greatest. Now, hear what that said. No person who has learned that to exist as the individual is the most terrifying thing of all will be afraid of saying it is the greatest. Existentialism, to exist, to be an individual in an absolute relation to God, that, Kierkegaard says, is what makes the Knight of Faith and what the Knight of Faith has to realize. So Kierkegaard continues, and he acknowledges something important here. He says that there may be some who need coercion, who if given free rein would riot in selfish pleasure like unbridled beasts, is no doubt true. But one should show precisely by the fact that one knows how to speak with fear and trembling that one is not of their number. So, anytime you mention the title of the book, Fear and Trembling, that's important. If you know how to speak with fear and trembling, you're not the person who says, I'm just going to be myself and let be what will be. This person that Kierkegaard is saying needs to just be themselves, doesn't let go of absolutes, doesn't let go of ethics, but they realize that they have to do something that perhaps no one can understand. Let's continue with what he says. He says, let us then consider more closely the distress and fear in the paradox of faith. The tragic hero renounces himself in order to express the universal. The Knight of Faith renounces the universal in order to be the particular. As mentioned, it all depends on how one is placed. Someone who believes it is a simple enough matter to be the individual can always be certain that he is not the Knight of Faith. For stragglers and vagrant geniuses are not men of faith. Faith's knight knows, on the contrary, that it is glorious to belong to the universal. So what's he saying here? To be a tragic hero is perhaps someone who gives themselves for a noble cause. Everyone feels sad for them. Everyone understands them. Following the universal can be understood. It can be admired. But by contrast, Kierkegaard says that the knight of faith loves the universal. He loves that tragic hero. But he must stand at times apparently against the universal in an absolute relation to the absolute. He must stand as himself before God. He can have a great mission in life, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else. So much more to say about that. Kierkegaard's own life comes into play here and explains a lot about why he thought this way. He famously was engaged to be married to the love of his life, Regine Olsen, and he cut off the engagement to pursue a life of philosophy and writing and theology, which he believed that God had for him. And few people could understand why he did that. But anyway, this is the way that Kierkegaard says it's harder to be the individual than it is to express the universal. It's not by hating the universal. It's not by hating God's ethical standards. It's by loving the universal and knowing that one must sometimes violate that, and perhaps no one will understand. Okay, so it can be harder to be the individual, and we'll circle around to some of those difficulties that come up from putting it in those terms. But a third reason why this book is so influential. Sometimes life doesn't make sense. Again, I think this can be quite appealing now, just as it could have been then. There have followed in the wake of Kierkegaard people who they love this thing about, existing as the individual. Some people have come along as atheist or agnostic existentialists, and what they would say is, yeah, sometimes life doesn't make sense. It's absurd, to use a word that Kierkegaard uses in Fear and Trembling. But what they would say is, yeah, life's absurd, and you just have to deal with it. You just have to step into the abyss and make something of life yourself, which to me sounds kind of bleak. And I guess it's neither here nor there if it is, if it's true, but that's not quite Kierkegaard's opinion here. It's not just make things up for yourself, make your own meaning, maybe I should say. But he will say sometimes life doesn't make sense. So what does he mean when he says, for instance, Kierkegaard, he says, quote, "For the movement of faith must be made continually on the strength of the absurd." What does Kierkegaard mean when he says sometimes it just doesn't make sense, and faith means stepping into that? Well, I want to illustrate what he means here by what else? An illustration from Lord of the Rings. This is from The Return of the King. So here's Sam, Frodo's companion, talking, and he's thinking about how difficult it's been and the things that he might never see again. And he says, "So that was the job I felt I had to do when I started," thought Sam. "To help Mr. Frodo to the last step and then die with him? Well, if that is the job, then I must do it. But I would dearly like to see Bywater again, and Rosie Cotton and her brothers, and the Gaffer and Marigold and all. I can't think somehow that Gandalf would have sent Mr. Frodo on this errand if there hadn't been any hope of his ever coming back at all. Things all went wrong when he went down in Moria. I wish he hadn't. He would have done something." The book continues, "But even as hope died in Sam, or seemed to die, it was turned to a new strength. Sam's plain hobbit face grew stern, almost grim, as the will hardened in him, and he felt through all his limbs a thrill, as if he was turning into some creature of stone and steel that neither despair nor weariness nor endless barren miles could subdue." So Sam sort of, he thinks, why would we go on this errand if there's no possibility of regaining anything good, if we're just going to be doomed to die in the result? But then he has this strength, and it mentions his face. His hobbit face grew stern. And you're perhaps reminded of this passage in the Gospel of Luke, Luke 9:51, when it says, when the days were appointed for his ascension, that is Jesus' ascension, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. A literal translation there. Jesus set his face to do this hard thing, and we know, of course, that Jesus, when he gets there, is going to die, and then he's going to ascend, as the text says. So Sam thinks, is there just no hope? But then all of a sudden he has this determination that seems to defy all hope, or lack thereof. But then there's this wonderful passage after the deed has been done and the battle won, so to speak, where it says, Sam lay back and stared with open mouth, and for a moment, between bewilderment and great joy, he could not answer. At last he gasped, Gandalf? I thought you were dead. But then I thought I was dead myself. Is everything sad going to come untrue? What's happened to the world? So you could think of other passages as well. There's a great passage a little bit later where Faramir is talking with Éowyn, and they are completely unaware of what's happening with Frodo and Sam. They're completely unaware of what's happening with the battle, as Aragorn and the company have come to the Black Gate to withstand Sauron. For all they know, everything is just going to be engulfed in darkness. And Faramir says the following. He says, the reason of my waking mind tells me that great evil has befallen, and we stand at the end of days. But my heart says nay, and all my limbs are light, and a hope and joy are come to me that no reason can deny. Éowyn, Éowyn, White Lady of Rohan, in this hour I do not believe that any darkness will endure. So there's this, what reason would tell you, but then there's what your heart is telling you. And so Abraham, he receives Isaac back. If you lose your life, you'll save it. This is what Kierkegaard had in mind when he talked about the absurd. This is where reason leaves off and faith kicks in. Okay, so a third reason why this book is influential. Sometimes life doesn't make any sense, and we need to find sense within it. Fourth reason, rather, that this book is influential is that life is a journey, and life is sometimes a terrifying journey. You know, who doesn't love a story with tons of frightful peril, and we aren't sure if it's going to turn out well with the protagonists? But why do we love these stories? Let me read to you a passage from Fear and Trembling. Kierkegaard says, or Johannes says, but he, that is the knight of faith, also knows that higher up there winds a lonely path, narrow and steep. He knows it is terrible to be born in solitude outside the universal, to walk without meeting a single traveler. He knows very well where he is and how he is related to men. Humanly speaking, he is insane and cannot make himself understood to anyone. And yet, insane is the mildest expression for him. If he isn't viewed thus, he is a hypocrite, and the higher up the path he climbs, the more dreadful a hypocrite he becomes. So Kierkegaard paints this picture of the knight of faith taking this narrowing, ascending, winding journey, and no one can understand him. So I want you to consider another passage in The Lord of the Rings where Tolkien almost certainly takes this very idea from Kierkegaard, Tolkien writing after Kierkegaard wrote, and I want you to see how some of these ideas and even the words show up. So Tolkien writes, care was certainly needed. Frodo and Sam at first felt easier, having now a wall on either side, but the stairway was almost as steep as a ladder, and as they climbed up and up, They became more and more aware of the long black fall behind them. And the steps were narrow, spaced unevenly, and often treacherous. They were worn and smooth at the edges, and some were broken, and some cracked as foot was set upon them. The hobbits struggled on until at last they were clinging with desperate fingers to the steps ahead and forcing their aching knees to bend and straighten. And ever as the stair cut its way deeper into the sheer mountain, the rocky walls rose higher and higher above their heads. There's another passage describing this journey. It says, "Here the huge cliff face sloped backwards, and the path like a snake wound to and fro across it." So just in those descriptions, you can see the winding nature of the path. It's lonely, it's narrow, it's steep. There's this solitude that Frodo and Sam alone are taking this journey. It's insane. And here I'd like to return to the idea of Kierkegaard writing under a false name, Johannes de Silentio, and I want to focus on that last part, Silentio, silence. Part of the brilliance of using that name, as Alistair Hannay says in his great introduction to the book, is he says, "If we are to talk of faith at all, it is of something we cannot explain," hence Silentio, "in any language that suffices for people to describe and justify their actions and attitudes to one another." So you can't explain what you have to do, you just know that you have to do it. You stand as the individual in an absolute relation to God. So, as you can imagine, what type of faith is this? It's not a faith just that God exists, or something like that, or just that something happened. This is the type of faith that bids a person take up their cross and follow Jesus. This is the type of faith that asks you to do something that just doesn't quite make sense. It's the type of faith that sends Frodo and Sam on what even Gandalf himself, who beckons them to do this, calls a fool's hope. It's a faith that relies on the strength of the absurd. So, Hegel, by contrast, said essentially that every generation could just build upon the progress of the former. They just have to learn the right things, and they can advance up from art to religion to philosophy and ultimately to a perfect sort of system, or at least as close to that as we can come. Kierkegaard says something much more important, though there might be some truths to advancing that certainly Hegel is getting at. But where Kierkegaard disagrees is he says that when it comes to faith, or love for that matter, you can't just sort of build upon the understanding of the former generation. You have to exist. You have to go on the journey yourself. You have to discover what faith means as the individual, or for that matter, what love means as the individual. You have to go on the journey. There's a great passage at the end of the Gospel of John that I think illustrates this point, and Kierkegaard probably would have thought so. It's John 21, beginning in verse 20. Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who also had leaned back on his bosom at the supper and said, "Lord, who is the one who betrays you?" So Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, "Lord, and what about this man?" Jesus said to him, "If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." And I love this because what John has to do is not what Peter has to do. Each individual has to follow God, and they don't necessarily understand all that that's going to entail. My friend Joel in episode 6 talked about this very passage as being important in one's faith journey, and I definitely agree. So, has there been any pushback to Kierkegaard's ideas? This is not the place to discuss that. As you can imagine, the discussion has been vast, agreement, disagreement. There are experts on the thought of just Kierkegaard himself. I mean, there are Kierkegaard scholars out there. I am not one of them by any means. But what I want to do is just very briefly to mention a book that I read somewhat recently and how it interacts with this work. It's Christopher Watkin. It's called Biblical Critical Theory, and I enjoyed this book quite a bit. And it's practically all about these paradoxes and how culture and popular and intellectual thought will sort of lead to these extremes that the Bible does a good job of holding together. And so it's all about paradox, and you'd think that he would really appreciate how Kierkegaard talks about this paradox of faith. But Watkin had a beef sort of with Kierkegaard because of separating faith and reason, because faith begins where thinking leaves off, as Kierkegaard famously said. So that was one of Watkins's major issues with it. He said on page 258 of his book, Watkin said, "Although the Kierkegaardian leap of faith has become the most common picture of faith today, it is profoundly at variance with the biblical account." So, strong words there. But actually, I think that Watkin himself, earlier in the book, is really more sympathetic to Kierkegaard's view than he thought. So consider what Watkin said earlier in his book, on pages 248 and 249. He said, and this is referring to earlier in Abraham's life before the sacrifice of Isaac, the attempted sacrifice of Isaac, I should say. Watkin said, "Humanly speaking, if you know what you're getting into, you are entering a contract. You set limits on the commitment, you perform a cost-benefit analysis in advance, you calculate. But Abram has no opportunity to perform a cost-benefit analysis in advance. He does not know what he is getting himself into. He does not calculate. All he knows is that God has spoken to him and made spectacular promises, and that is enough." So I think that is a little bit more sympathetic to what Kierkegaard is getting at. So Kierkegaard says, again, famously, about faith beginning where thinking leaves off. He says, "What I intend now is to extract from the story of Abraham its dialectical element in the form of problemata, in order to see how monstrous a paradox faith is. A paradox capable of making a murder into a holy act well-pleasing to God. A paradox which gives Isaac back to Abraham, which no thought can grasp, because faith begins precisely where thinking leaves off." So, as you can imagine from me reading that, Watkin did have a pretty strong reservation about a murderer being pleasing to God. That's just not what God is about, would say Watkin, and for great reason. Watkin points to the idea in the ancient Near East of human sacrifice. He points to Moloch, for instance, and how in the ancient Near East child sacrifice was a thing. So Abraham shouldn't be seen as like, "Oh, God, you want me to murder?" He might have just been like, "Well, that seems odd, but that's something that is done around here." I heard another interpretation recently that Abraham and Isaac is really the Bible's way of saying, don't sacrifice humans, which is interesting. But either way, even if you bring in that historical background, which Kierkegaard probably had some idea of, even if you bring in that background, what it does is it only sort of kicks the problem down the road a little bit, like kicking a can. It's still there, because even just the rest of the Pentateuch, of which Genesis is a part, makes very clear God doesn't want you to murder your children. So why would God be asking Abraham to do this? So this, again, is what Kierkegaard is trying to lean into. He's saying, don't try to avoid the paradox. So what's going on? Well, Watkin rightly recognizes this is a theme in Genesis where God seems to be asking people almost to give up the promise. There's a passage, Genesis 16:2, where Sarai is frustrated that she's not bearing any children, and so she says that God himself has prevented her from bearing children. The point there that's important is that God seems to be preventing the very fulfillment of his own promise. Abraham and Isaac is just a supreme example of the same sort of thing. God himself seems to be standing in the way of his very promise by asking Abraham to get rid of Isaac. So Watkin recognizes that. But also, connected to this theme of God seeming to stand in the way of his own promises, is the idea that sometimes things get messy. Nothing is messier than being asked to sacrifice your own son. It's just a paradox. It doesn't make sense. Think of another one. Jacob, there's Jacob and Esau, they're twins, and it's said that Jacob will be the child of the promise. But strangely, Isaac, their father, ends up favoring Esau. And so if Jacob is ever going to get this promise, this blessing given to him, then he has to trick and deceive his brother and his father in order to get it. He is the one who famously wrestles with God. So again, God is standing in the way of his promises, but does God want Jacob to be a cheater and a deceiver? Now we're getting a little closer to the paradox. Abraham and Isaac just take us to the pinnacle of the paradox and asks us whether we're going to flinch when we get there. So, does this make any sense? Maybe Kierkegaard's point is that it's not supposed to make any sense, but I do want to illustrate this again from Lord of the Rings to maybe help. So, Frodo pursues this hope that, like I said, even Gandalf himself, who tells him to do it, or that it should be done, calls this a fool's hope. Frodo gets to the end of the quest, against all odds, and just as he has the opportunity to achieve the quest and destroy the ring, what does he do? He takes it for himself, and he says, "The ring is mine." The ring only gets destroyed because Gollum, who's loves the ring and wants it for himself, he comes up and he grabs it from Frodo, he bites off his finger, and he takes it for himself, and then he stumbles off into the pit, and Gollum and the ring are destroyed. Now I want you to think about what Tolkien might be getting at there. What kind of hero is Frodo? Frodo, it's said in the book, is in some ways greater than even Bilbo himself, who went on the great journey in The Hobbit. But really, Sam, who goes with Frodo, is the tragic hero. He's the guy everyone can understand. He's loyal to his friend. He expresses, as Hegel would say, this universal. Everyone can agree that Sam does the right thing. But what Frodo does is he gets to the end, and because he's human, or hobbit, he makes the mistake, and he wants to take it for himself. And the ring is not destroyed by any act of heroism or nobility. The ring is simply destroyed because of sin, because of Gollum, because of the messiness that happens. Is God perhaps asking Abraham and asking us to trust not ourselves at all, but to trust him, and even to trust him when it means that we're going to make some of the worst mistakes of all? That, I think, is getting us closer to what this paradox of faith is all about. The paradox of faith, the paradox of trusting God, is not in coming to things that make sense to us. It's precisely when we recognize that the whole picture is beyond any of us. And because it is, there is no system of thought that if we just have it just right, we can perhaps understand and we can discover the will of God. The will of God and God's great story that we all have to experience is bigger than any of us. We get into that story and we can understand it in so many ways as we go about it, but there are certain things about it that just don't make sense, and we have to accept those things on the strength of the absurd. So that, according to Kierkegaard, is what faith is all about.